This is the third video in a series of 6 videos on why evolution is a religious theory. In the first video, we saw that Darwin had a religious background favoring religious beliefs, favoring evolutionary theory. He wasn't coming at it from a neutral religious perspective. He very much had religious feelings, and these were recorded. He recorded them in his notebooks, his private notebooks. In the second video, we saw that Darwin made religious arguments that hinged on religious premises that were crucial. The premises were crucial to the arguments, and the arguments were crucial to his theory. He made these arguments in his book on evolution, The Origin of Species, in 1859. Now here in the third video, we're going to address another rebuttal from evolutionists, which is, okay, so Darwin made religious arguments, theological arguments, but he was merely doing reductio theology. What is that? What is reductio theology? Reductio meaning, well, he had to address the existing theory. The existing theory was religious, so Darwin had to make religious arguments. But they were merely targeted at the existing theory. He was simply demonstrating that the existing theory was wrong, was failing, was falsified by the scientific evidence, and he was pointing that out for the good of the audience. Otherwise, these arguments were dispensable to him. They weren't integral to his theory. They weren't part of his theory at all. They were just simply side arguments for the purpose of showing that creationism of the day was failing. Now, creationism of the day was advocated mainly by natural theologians. There were other movements as well, but natural theology was a powerful movement. From roughly, say, 1700 to 1850. So when Darwin was a young man in the early 1800s, and while he was developing his theory in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, natural theology was very much a going theory. So that's kind of the group that he was addressing, the natural theologians and their claims about design and creationism. The world exhibits design. It looks like it was designed by God. God created the world. The evidences show that. They demonstrate that God designed and created the world. Natural theology. So Darwin was addressing that and showing why it was failing. That's the argument here. Well, again, not true. And I'll look at one example in particular that demonstrates this, although there are many examples in Darwin's book which natural theologians would not recognize. But let's look at one example in particular that really makes this obvious. What we're going to see is that Darwin's claims would not be recognized by the natural theologians, and the theory of origins, the theory of independent creation that Darwin was addressing and claiming to be false, would not be recognized by the natural theologians. Now we're going to look at chapter 6 of Origins, again an interesting chapter where Darwin looks at the problems with the theory but actually ends up making all kinds of powerful arguments for his theory, while he supposedly is looking at the problems with his theory. So in chapter 6, Darwin makes several arguments for why evolution and common descent must be true. The most powerful of these arguments were from utilitarianism. And in particular, Darwin argues that so much of the biological world exhibits disutility. Darwin finds disutility all through the species, all through the biological world. And these examples of disutility are what Darwin finds to be so persuasive, so compelling, that you can immediately conclude that they arose by descent, not by design. Now, why is this true? How can he conclude this? Because Darwin was a utilitarian, and what that means in this context, in the context of origins and theories of origin and natural theology in the 18th and 19th centuries, the idea of utilitarianism in that context was that God would create the world to be maximally or optimally fit and display utility. There would be no examples of disutility. Everything would work perfectly. The species would be designed perfectly adapted for their environments. This is the utilitarian argument, the utilitarian view of what God would do. So it's a theological argument. Let's put it this way. It's a conditional. If God created the world, if God designed and created the world, it would be perfectly adapted. All of the species, everything would be perfectly adapted. And so every time you find an example of something that is not perfectly adapted, or appears to be not perfectly adapted, it is right there an example, a proof text of evolution. Somehow, some way, those species must not have been designed. Therefore, they must have evolved somehow. So evolution must be true one way or another, even though we don't really know how it could have worked. Darwin may not have known how it could have worked, but it must be true. So in Chapter 6, Darwin wants to make these powerful arguments. He can't let this slip by. In fact, these arguments appeared throughout the book, but he especially introduces them there in Chapter 6. And he dearly wants to make this argument because this is perhaps the most powerful argument for his theory throughout the entire book. So he's really hinging on these arguments. He's got to make these arguments, but in order to make sense out of them, he has to reveal to the reader that this is all based on utilitarianism. And if utilitarianism isn't true, if God creates the species for non-utility, non-material reasons, then his theory is false. This idea would be, as you put it, absolutely fatal to my theory. Those were his words in Chapter 6. If true, this would be absolutely fatal to my theory. And what was he referring to? The doctrine of that God could create the species for non-material, non-utility reasons, not merely for utility. That would be fatal to his theory. So in other words, Darwin is saying right there in Chapter 6, revealing to the reader, my theory absolutely hinges on a religious claim, a religious view, a religious doctrine, the doctrine of utilitarianism. And then he goes on to cite several examples of disutility, which he feels proves his case. But right there you have the admission that this theory is a religious theory. Now, what's important here is that this utilitarian view was not the going view, was not the current view of the natural theologians. It is true that there was an influence. Utilitarianism was influential on natural theology, and there were some natural theologians, most notably William Paley, who did experiment with and go quite a ways with utilitarian thinking. But that caused controversy because that was by no means the standard line. Natural theology, throughout its more than a century history, very much depended on and incorporated non-utilitarian ideas. God could create for all kinds of reasons, and the natural theologians found evidences for design and evidences for creation in non-material reasons. The delight that the world brings to its creatures, including us, including God, the order that we find in the world, order and patterns which may not be optimal. So there were non-material reasons that God was using as well as utilitarian reasons. And of course this is found in the scriptures as well. They were simply going by what the scriptures were telling them. So it wasn't exactly a revolutionary idea, but it is found throughout the natural theologians' writings, the non-utilitarian aspect of design and creation. And so Darwin had to address it. Darwin knew that there were these natural theologians out there who were not utilitarians. And he had to admit that if they're right, I'm wrong. My theory is staked to utilitarianism. So let me read to you the quote here where he talks about this. The foregoing remarks lead me to say a few words on the protests lately made by some naturalists against the utilitarian doctrine. And what is that doctrine? That every detail of structure has been produced for the good of its possessor. They believe, these natural theologians, that very many structures have been created for beauty in the eyes of man or for mere variety. And there's also delight, which he talks about later. This doctrine, if true, would be absolutely fatal to my theory. So there you have it. Darwin is staking himself and informing the reader right there. My theory is a religious theory. It incorporates a religious doctrine. It hinges on, it entails a religious doctrine which is not the doctrine of the natural theologians. So he wasn't merely doing reductio theology, and this was not dispensable by any means. This was core to his theory. It his theory, it would be absolutely fatal if it wasn't true. It was absolutely core to his theory. Now let me read to you an example of the following passage where Darwin cites examples of disutility and why he finds them to be so powerful. Let's have a look here. Thus, we can hardly believe that the webbed feet of the upland goose or of the frigate bird are of special use to these birds. We cannot believe that the same bones in the arm of the monkey, in the foreleg of the horse, in the wing of the bat, and in the flipper of the seal are of special use to these animals. We may safely attribute these structures to inheritance. In other words, they weren't designed, they weren't created for that purpose. They came from some earlier species and they were inherited with some modifications. Now, this may be a little confusing to you. What's he complaining about here again? Let me go through this a little slower here and explain. Thus, we can hardly believe that the webbed feet of the upland goose or of the frigate bird are of special use to these birds. So that's his first complaint here in this paragraph. What's going on here? Okay, the upland goose, that's a goose that doesn't go near the water very much. It's upland. And yet it has webbed feet. What is that? Webbed feet. Well, webbed feet what are they for? It's for swimming, right? Paddling around in the water. Why would an upland goose have webbed feet? That's not optimal. That's not adapted to its drier environment, in its upland environment. Same thing with the frigate bird. Now, there are explanations for this and why that might be the case, but I'm not going to get into that here. My point here is simply Darwin is expressing high confidence that this proves descent, inheritance, because it isn't optimal, it isn't adapted the way he thinks it should be adapted. So you see how nuanced this is. It's not like it's a terrible design. It's not like it's not working. It's not like the species is dying off because of it. It's not as though it's causing big problems. It just doesn't fit with this very fine, nuanced doctrine that he has of, this isn't quite right. It must not have been designed. It's almost like dysteleology. It doesn't appear to be designed, but we do have an appeal to utility, to function, to a material function. Everything must be designed for material function by God. God must design things only for material function, according to Darwin, according to utilitarianism. Now, what about this second example Darwin cites in the paragraph? Let's read that again. We cannot believe that the same bones in the arm of the monkey, in the foreleg of the horse, in the wing of the bat, and in the flipper of the seal are of special use to these animals. Something's wrong here. It's not optimal. It's not maximally utilitarian. Why is that? Because there's a common pattern. It's this pentadactyl pattern we talk about in the forelimb and in the hind limb of so many animals. You find a similar pattern of bones. Of course, it varies wildly in these different animals, the aspect ratios and the particular designs, but still you can pick out a pattern. And why would there be a similar pattern for in a monkey, which is grasping and climbing, and a horse, which is walking, in the wing of the bat, which is flying, the flipper of the seal, which is swimming? Obviously, these are all different applications, different uses. You wouldn't expect to have any similarities in the designs. If these designs are created, if these structures are designed and created by God, they would have been optimal for their environment and their use. So in one case, you might have one design. In another case, you have a completely different design. If they're independently created by God for these different uses, there wouldn't be any similarity between them. And yet we see this similarity here. And so that's evidence for Darwin that those designs, those structures were not optimally fit, not optimally utilitarian. There's some disutility apparently there. How could they be optimal for the same design used for different applications? Now, again, it's really not the same design very much. There's huge differences in the aspect ratios and the particular designs of the bones, but there's this similar pattern. And Darwin cites this as powerful evidence for his theory. Now, in addition to this being a religious argument and not reductio theology and not dispensable to his theory, I also just want you to appreciate the subtlety here and the nuance in this argument, and how Darwin and later evolutionists are really down in the details here, and it is these details of biology that bother them religiously. If you read this passage here, there's no mention of God. It almost sounds scientific, but it isn't, of course. It is relying on this utilitarian view of creation, of creationism and design. And these details are bothering Darwin and the evolutionists. God wouldn't have done it that way. These bone structures that are similar in different species, God wouldn't do it that way, and we know that. We know that we should have something different than that. We don't know. Of course, we've never created a bat. We don't know how to do that, but it wouldn't be done that way. So, bottom line for this video, Darwin wasn't merely doing reductio theology, and his religious arguments were by no means dispensable.